Liberals in the news media once again pandering to the conservative news agenda. Folks, you've heard me say this before. I am a liberal. I have liberal views. But I have to say, I often find myself utterly detesting other liberals. And the recent coverage of Medicare is a perfect, of Obamacare is a perfect example of this. You see people who claim to be liberal, who claim to see through this fog machine, this bubble of the conservative media establishment, and yet they fall right into it. And they do their dirty work, from Jon Stewart, Kirsten Powers on down. Folks, I'm not saying that any Democrat deserves a blank check and deserves unmitigated praise no matter what. But it seems to me we are missing the big points here regarding Obamacare. Let's go back to 1789. Imagine, for example, the U.S. War Department had been set up inefficiently. Does anyone really think can they say with a straight face that, wow, that first year in 1789, everything wasn't perfect, so we should have just never had a War Department? And who cares about World War I? And if the Japanese had bombed us, well, you know what? At least we wouldn't have had that inefficiency and waste in 1789. So they could have bombed us, taken over Hawaii, perhaps California. It would have been well worth it because we wouldn't have had the continuing inefficiency of the War Department in 1790 and 1791. Anyone who said that would be denounced as an utter imbecile. And yet that's essentially the argument we're seeing now about Obamacare. Because somehow a website isn't perfect. Well, the whole thing should be thrown away in the trash can. It is utterly preposterous. You expect such idiocy from conservatives. What I am disappointed in is the so-called mainstream media and even liberal commentators essentially giving aid and comfort to this form of idiocy. Whereas what they should be pointing out is, okay, fine. I wish the website were perfect day one. I wish everything about Obama were perfect day one, and people need to do better. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying everything is perfect with Obamacare. But let's not lose sight of the big picture. The big picture is Obamacare is wildly complicated because conservatives mandated it. Because conservatives didn't want a simple single-payer health care plan. Every form of complication now, because of the state's involvement, insurance companies' involvement, is all 100% a function of what conservatives mandated. And for them to be screaming and crying and all this angst because somehow it's not perfect, that's just too rich, my friends. And of course you expect conservatives to lie. That's why they are conservatives. But you do not expect mainstream media reporters, liberal commentators to essentially be buying into this whole zeitgeist. And they ought to be reminding people every single day that there's never in the history of the world been some program implemented that involved 100 million people, an entire society, that involved every level of government and state and national and every kind of private sector corporation, i.e. all the insurance companies. There's never in the history of the world something like that been done, and it's been flawless. And what ought to be pointed out is that people who are constantly carping, fundamentally, you strip everything away, they fundamentally do not believe that tens of millions of Americans deserve decent health care. That's what it's about. They fundamentally do not believe that people with pre-existing conditions should ever be allowed to live without constant fear that the next cold will kill them. And folks, that's so sickening and disgusting, it seems impolite to talk about people who are so hateful and so utterly detest anyone who isn't wealthy or at least upper middle class. But that's what we're faced with conservative opposition to Obamacare, my friends. It's ugly, it's vicious. That's the real truth that needs to be talked about again and again and again, Mainstream media is burying it. Liberal commentators are burying it. I guess we have to talk about it here.